Managing, Settling and Preventing Ethnic Conflicts, the Main Approaches and Lessons from Success and Failure. A 59-minute presentation held in the Nelson Lecture Theatre at the Joint Services Command Staff College, Shrivenham, on the 9th of June 2006. The speaker is Dr. Stephen Wolfe, a Professor of Political Science at the University of Bath. This presentation is the second of 4 dealing with international intervention in ethnic conflicts. Please note that there are some references to the visual aids that we used during the presentation. Dr. Stephen Wolfe.
So what I want to do today is talk a little bit more on one of the themes that I raised last week, namely how can we actually do anything about these dreadful conflicts that I had these nice colored photographs of last week. And basically the way in which I want to approach this is basically looking at 3 different dimensions of this broader issue of doing something about these conflicts. And obviously the best way of doing something is if we can prevent them in the first place. But recent track records suggest that this is not always possible, and unfortunately what I'll be presenting in terms of preventing, there are very, very few examples, and I sometimes have to think really, really hard what actually counts as a successfully prevented conflict. Then obviously conflict management and conflict settlements are areas where there has been a lot more activity ongoing. Again, very mixed track record, and I will come back to that during the course of the lecture. Now, let me just start out by saying quickly what I mean by conflict prevention, conflict management, and conflict settlement, before then going a little bit more in detail into conflict settlement and different approaches there too, and what works and what doesn't work in my experience. Okay, conflict prevention, very straightforward set of strategies adopted at an early stage of the conflict, usually prior to violent escalation of the conflict, or conflict prevention comes back into the game after you have achieved a ceasefire or a settlement, when basically you want to prevent the re-eruption of violence in an ongoing peace process or political process. Good example of that, Serbia and Montenegro in 2003, the European Union brokered a deal there between the 2 countries that basically meant they would stay together for another 3 years, then there would be a referendum in Montenegro, and the result of this referendum would be accepted as binding both by Serbia and Montenegro as well as by the international community. And 2 weeks ago this referendum happened, and surprise, surprise, majority of Montenegrins, of participants in the referendum, decided that they wanted independence, and I think it was yesterday or the day before that Montenegro officially declared itself independent from Serbia. So in this sense, the last of the republics of the former Yugoslavia now has achieved independent statehood. In the case of Kosovo, we'll probably see by the end of the year that sort of the very, very last possible entity to gain independence will achieve that as well. Now, what is important about conflict prevention also is that it usually involves some sort of attitudinal change and occurs in multiple sectors of society. That is something that successful conflict prevention has in common with successful conflict settlement. Example here would be the Crimea in the 1990s, where there was in the early 1990s, around the breakup of the Soviet Union, some real danger that not only would you likely have violent conflict in the Crimea itself, but possibly that this could possibly draw 2 major, at the time, nuclear powers, namely Russia and Ukraine as 2 successor states, into conflict as well. Now what happened was that, first of all, Russia played a reasonably constructive role in this particular conflict, not contributing to escalation. The Ukrainian side at the time proved to be relatively generous in terms of the concessions that it made, allowing Crimea to become the only autonomous territory within the newly independent Republic of Ukraine. So that basically both the external as well as the internal dimensions of this potential conflict were resolved relatively early, and it did not come to any major violence or prolonged or protracted ethnic conflict, either within Crimea between the different ethnic groups there, or between Crimea as an entity and Ukraine as the metropolitan state. And finally, what conflict prevention tries to do is to aims at channeling conflict into non-violent behavior by providing incentives for peaceful accommodation and or by raising costs of violent escalation of the conflict for either one party in particular or both parties. And a good example here, in my view, is Macedonia and the Ohrid Agreement of 2001 that was achieved, which basically only came about because of intense pressure that both the European Union, backed up by NATO, put on both the Albanians in Macedonia and the Macedonian government, as well as also using any leverage that in particular NATO had on the Albanians in Kosovo. Again, you see sort of this regional dimension here to some extent that I mentioned last week already. However, Macedonia is also a good case to make clear that conflict prevention is a really difficult concept to grasp, because in many ways it's a running or a moving target. So yes, to some extent you could say Macedonia was a successful case of conflict prevention, because what it essentially managed to do was prevent major civil war. Now, by other accounts, you would say it was a complete failure, because after all, you did have violence. About 6 months of various degrees of military hostilities between the so-called National Liberation Army of the Macedonian Albanians, backed and supplied with weapons mostly from their ethnic cousins in Kosovo, and on the other hand, the relatively ill-equipped, poorly trained Macedonian security forces. So to that extent, obviously, conflict prevention failed. Whereas from the early 1990s until 2001, Macedonia always had been a little bit on the brink, sometimes closer to the edge, sometimes not so close to the edge, of this kind of conflict. Eventually, in 2001, this conflict broke out, but it was relatively swiftly contained. And the real success of prevention here was to prevent major civil war, as you had in the early 1990s in Croatia and then early to mid 1990s in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Conflict management, and this is a slightly trickier approach, so to speak, because here what you really try to do is contain conflict in the absence of any possibility of settling it at any given time. So we are past the ability to prevent conflict because it's already, there's violence going on, but we are not at a period in time in the conflict cycle yet where we can credibly say, okay, now there is a window of opportunity to settle this conflict. So conflict management therefore tries to contain, limit, or in any way otherwise direct or channel the consequences of conflict. Various examples here. Middle East since 1967, Macedonia, sort of this whole period 1991 to 2001, and then Burundi in particular since 1993, since the military coup there. I think in various ways you can see all of these episodes here as elements or as having contained elements of conflict management. Macedonia here in particular, I do not so much refer to the conflict within Macedonia, but rather at sort of the various spillover missions that existed in the country throughout the 1990s, trying to prevent a spillover from conflict in other parts of Yugoslavia, and thereby managing sort of very, very carefully the relatively precarious conflict situation, balance of power within Macedonia itself. Burundi, again, on some level you could put this into a case of conflict prevention, to some extent even successful conflict prevention, only that what you prevented there in the end was only a genocide. You still had relatively large-scale violence following the coup in 1993, about 150 to 200,000 people killed, but then compare that to neighboring Rwanda, where within 6 to 8 months you had about 1 million people killed. So there was some element of prevention in conflict management here as well. As I already said, conflict management is usually a strategy that you adopt when conflict settlement is not possible, and that obviously includes situations where it's either just simply not possible because the aims of the conflict parties are too far apart, or when it is specifically undesirable for one party, when one party actually derives more benefits from continuing conflict rather than from settling at a given point in time. And that obviously can mean both immediate conflict parties but also third parties who, for reasons of their own, might want to keep some sort of low intensity and sometimes high intensity conflict going, enabling them then to pursue other items on their agenda more efficiently. Examples here would include Kashmir. Basically, since the partition of British India, I've just been at a seminar in Dublin over the past 2 days where we discussed various options sort of in the broader subcontinental environment in Asia, what to do with all the conflicts in India and around India, and what sort of options outside parties and the Indian government have there. And one of the key points that in particular Indian delegates made on that was that Kashmir really is one way for Pakistan to create enough instability in India to make sure that India does not become too much of a hegemonic power on the subcontinent. And there are various arguments, reasonably good arguments against that. Pakistan is a nuclear power now, so do you really need Kashmir to keep India in check? Is India really the big threat given that China is another major player on the subcontinent? Nevertheless, just in the context of this lecture here, Kashmir as a conflict management strategy would be seen from the Pakistani side something that is worth to be kept going, simply because it means that it enables Pakistan to exercise a certain degree of pressure on India, ensuring that India's allegedly hegemonic aspirations do not come to bear negatively on Pakistan. Northern Ireland, between the 1960s and late 1990s, here I would say there was basically just an inability, an impossibility to settle the conflict. So there was not necessarily any evil desires or conspiracies going on part of the Republic of Ireland, British government, or any of the conflict parties in Northern Ireland itself. It was simply that the interests and goals of the conflict parties were too far apart to achieve a reasonable settlement. And then obviously Iraq since 2003, there are third parties that don't want it settled, there are parties inside Iraq that don't want it settled or just can't get it settled. And this, what I've just said about conflicts sometimes being for some parties worthwhile to be kept going, that also means that conflict management is not necessarily always a benign strategy of limiting the negative effects of a particular conflict. But very often it is also conflict management strategies can be used actually to sort of manipulate conflicts for farther reaching aims that immediate conflict parties or third parties might have. There might be benefits to be gained from temporary escalation, temporary de-escalation of conflicts and so on and so forth. But very often what the result of this not so benign meddling in conflicts is that in the end you get really, really protracted, long-lasting conflicts. If you just look at some of the examples that I've given you here, Southern Sudan, that was the civil war that lasted for 30 years and actually benefited a lot of people on a lot of sides. There was an extensive slave trade that was going on. Southern Sudan and neighboring regions were used as staging areas for various rebel groups in Southern Sudan, in northern Uganda, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Kenya, you name it. Same thing for Kosovo. The Kosovo conflict really began in 1989. Some people would say even earlier, in the early years after Tito's death. But the key here really was to some extent that keeping Kosovo as a low-intensity conflict actually was quite beneficial for certain parts of the Yugoslav leadership at the time. Beginning in 1989-1990 with Milosevic actually being able to gain a majority of votes in the collective presidency of the former Yugoslavia, all the way through the 1990s, then one of the, I think, more credible explanations of Kosovo is that it really helped Milosevic to hold on to power after losing sort of every little bit of what might be termed a Greater Serbia throughout the 1990s. And then obviously in Transnistria, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, what has happened there since the early 1990s from a perspective of not benign intervention, it's obviously that Russia has managed to gain a foothold in Georgia and Moldova by strategically exploiting the conflicts going on there, weakening the governments of these countries, to some extent creating a little bit of a buffer zone here between itself and potential NATO or European Union membership in particular of these two countries. Now, conflict settlement, then sort of the absolute ideal of things, of the pièce de résistance, so to speak. What is aimed at here is in an institutional framework in which the various conflicting interests of the conflict parties can be accommodated in such a way that it is more beneficial for them to make sure that they do pursue this political and peaceful negotiation and bargaining process rather than continue with violence. And I'll come back to that point on the next slide, and I will try and illustrate that a little bit more graphically. That, I think, is very much what happened in Northern Ireland in 1998 and potentially over the years to come as well. That basically there was no gain for either of the parties to continue with a conflict that had basically resulted in a stalemate, where all sides clearly knew that the conflict could not be won militarily, or that the costs that this would have incurred simply not have been worth paying. So in 1998, the parties settled for something which, even though it has come unstuck several times since, has nevertheless provided a larger context in which violence in Northern Ireland, to the extent that it still exists, is much more of a criminal kind rather than of the political kind that basically was present there openly or not so openly since partition in the early 1920s. What conflict settlement ideally achieves is the accommodation of all claims of all parties. Now obviously this is a complete illusion, and I have yet to find a conflict in which this has really happened. So in reality then what normally goes on is that you have lots and lots of compromises, concessions. There's very often a give and take. You win on this issue, I win on that issue. And then increasingly what has also happened over the past, I would say, 5 to 6 years, is a strategy that has been adopted by international mediators, which basically tries to postpone particularly sensitive issues and decisions about these issues to a future date. Remember what I said about Serbia and Montenegro, the settlement in 2003. They agreed to postpone the issue of Montenegrin independence until a referendum to be held 3 years after the conclusion of their deal. Comprehensive peace agreement in Sudan signed last January. Referendum on the future constitutional status of South Sudan to be held 6 years after the conclusion of the agreement. Bougainville, a province in Papua New Guinea, 10 to 15 years after the autonomy arrangement had been agreed in, I think, 1998, 1999, a referendum will take place that will determine whether Bougainville will remain part of Papua New Guinea or become independent. And so the list goes on. I mean, even in Northern Ireland there is a provision to this effect that a so-called border question will be asked according to the Good Friday Agreement, regular intervals, roughly every 7 years. So conflict parties basically agree to settle the issues that they can settle now, stop with the violence, and come back to the more sensitive ones after a certain period of time when sort of things have calmed down a little bit, and that seems to be working reasonably well, certainly in the limited number of cases which provide evidence here. And finally, what conflict settlement normally also implies is negotiated, accepted and implemented institutional structures. And the example that I've given here is the province of Aceh in Indonesia, 2005, where yes, there was negotiation that was successful, there was acceptance that was successful, but there's a little bit of a problem now with the implementation of the actual agreement in terms of translating the agreement into proper constitutional law in Indonesia. Now, I think there are basically three phases to this process of conflict settlement. They are all quite closely related to each other and cannot really be thought of as necessarily separate phases. There normally is a negotiation period in which the parties sit down at a table, or in which you have sort of proximity talks where mediators go between different rooms or fly between different countries, in which the parties really negotiate this kind of institutional framework that I was talking about, in which they basically lock themselves into a deal that says, okay, we establish certain procedures here that will allow us to deal with any conflicts of interest in the future in a way that will let us, sort of give us an opportunity to do that without shooting each other. Now, this is very often complicated enough, but it's for the most part the much easier element of conflict settlement. The real crunch very often comes in this so-called implementation stage. Once you have signed the deal, then you actually need to implement it. And that sometimes can mean just rewriting the constitution as it exists. Sometimes it means creating completely new institutional structures. I'll give you a couple of examples of what these various phases involve in a minute. But implementation usually is particularly difficult because different parties very often have different interpretations of what they actually negotiated. There's a term that was created a couple of years ago, I think in the context of Northern Ireland, which is called constructive ambiguity. So you definitely and deliberately leave certain things ambiguous in terms of what they really mean. The advantage of this is that the leaders who have negotiated the agreement can then turn around to their constituents and say, we have negotiated the first step towards Irish reunification, or they turn the other way and they say, we have negotiated the perpetual union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, this is fine, because that usually means that you can get anything approved in a referendum, but then when it actually comes to implementing the agreement that you have signed, then it becomes very difficult if you actually find that, well, actually you have not really secured this particular deal. Actually, what you have signed up commits you to doing X, Y, and Z, which you may not have bargained for in the original negotiations. So very often implementation processes is where settlements end, and if you then don't have proper conflict prevention mechanisms already around, then very often things can quickly deteriorate into violence and civil war again. Then after implementation comes operation, where you then sort of try to live with the arrangements that you have negotiated and implemented. And both of these stages, operation and implementation, in a number of cases, sort of you have to go back to the negotiation table, either because certain things are just impossible to do. So for example, you may find that you don't have enough money to pay for something in particular, so you have to renegotiate it. Or you might find that particular provisions that you have in the agreement that you signed may in fact not be necessary, so you can do away with them after you have run on them for, say, 5, 6, 7 years, and you can sort of soften sometimes quite rigid power sharing arrangements and can make the state more inclusive. This is a process that, for example, is underway in Bosnia and Herzegovina at the moment, or rather since sort of last November. Some very interesting steps were taken in terms of re-centralizing the Bosnian state, integrating of defense forces, intelligence, police, and so on and so forth. So it's really important to bear in mind that these three processes of the phases of conflict settlement are distinct in some way, but they also hang very, very closely together. Now, what does negotiation mean? Well, it means that, first of all, the parties need to agree to a bargaining process, and in this bargaining process, they make certain compromises, concessions, and as I already said, they withdraw or postpone to act on very specific claims. The outcomes of negotiation processes normally include that you have institutional arrangements in place that help you resolve differences in the future, that you agree on elections, both dates of elections as well as electoral systems, that you reach agreement on transitional justice issues, so do you have a truth commission, do you not have a truth commission, and very often in this whole area of reintegration of former combatants. Sometimes it's also abbreviated DDR, demobilization, disarmament and reintegration. And that also is sometimes quite difficult process, in particular in the implementation phase, where quite often it can come unstuck if some people feel that they don't get enough money to actually let go of their guns, that their status as combatants is in no way matched by their new status as, I don't know, farmer or office worker or something like that. So this, I would say, is just sort of a rough idea about what at the end of a successful negotiation process you really have. Now I just want to illustrate a little bit how sort of bargaining in these negotiations works, and sort of example is territorial bargaining model, because I strongly believe that autonomy is usually a very good way of handling quite a number of conflicts. So if we think that we have two parties at the negotiation table here, central government, ethnic minority, we sort of have a range of preferences. Obviously, the higher on the plus side you get, the happier you are with the outcome. Now, obviously, an ethnic minority that seeks secession, best outcome for them would be independence, whereas central government, obviously direct rule of a restive population, restive territory, would be the ideal that they could achieve. Obviously, there's a sort of gradient here where the ethnic minority might still be better off settling for a conflict at some stage here above the baseline. But the closer they come to direct rule, obviously, the less happy they will be, and they might find actually anything below this baseline, they are just better off continuing with violence. Now, what the central government perception is obviously exactly the opposite. So the closer to direct rule they can achieve a settlement, the happier they will be. The more it goes towards independence, obviously the less amenable they will be to reach an agreement. So what this basically means is that local self-government would be the absolute minimum that an ethnic minority would be able to accept in this kind of model, whereas for the central government, complete territorial autonomy or some kind of glorified quasi-independence where the central government only retains, I don't know, foreign affairs and defense and maybe fiscal policy as its core competences. These are sort of the absolute outsides of a possible deal that can be reached. So ethnic minority will not agree to anything less than local self-government. Central government will not agree to anything less than the very most, this status of very high autonomy, which still sort of leaves the pretense of sovereign government within a territorially unified state. Now this gives us this nice triangle here in the middle, which is basically the bargaining space of enhanced self-government for the minority or substantial autonomy that it can get. And really the art of negotiation is to find a settlement that is somewhere in here, because what it means is that both parties are better off settling than they would be if they continued with their conflict. So this in a sense then means that the best way in which negotiations are conducted would be to create a win-win situation, so that no party is a loser as the outcome of the negotiations. So if both sides find themselves better off with a settlement, then there is a realistic chance that you actually will achieve a settlement. Otherwise, you're basically going for some kind of more or less military solution. Either immediately, government quashes the minority, or the minority defeats the government and achieves independence, or some limbo state in the interim where violence eventually will break out again. If we assume that we have landed somewhere in this triangle, we can then move on to the implementation stage, and basically the conflict parties or formal conflict parties deliver on the agreement. What this typically involves is either some sort of institutional reform or institution building. You find that in Macedonia after the 2001 Ohrid Agreement. Then what I already mentioned, DDR, the demobilization, disarmament and reintegration of ex-combatants, was a big part of the Bosnia-Herzegovina Dayton Agreement. Reintegration of refugees and IDPs, sometimes very important. I mean, Sudan, the conflict in the south, as well as if we look at Darfur now at the moment, over the years, decades that these conflicts lasted, created millions and millions of refugees. Not all of them necessarily wanted to come back, but quite large numbers did want to come back. So bringing these people back, reintegrating them, very important part of implementation. Then obviously elections, you had election referendum in Northern Ireland almost immediately after the agreement was concluded in 1998. Other expected outcomes of the implementation phase obviously include economic recovery. I've decided to leave East Timor here as an example, even though it was not such a great choice last week when I spoke about successful international interventions. But economic recovery in East Timor, actually that has been going quite well, particularly because East Timor now for the first time since 1975 actually has had control over its own natural resources. There's quite a bit of oil around there, so the economy in East Timor actually has not been going too badly. You would also expect that civil society is being rebuilt. Kosovo, I think one could probably even argue that there has been too much civil society rebuilt. I think Kosovo is the place in the world which has the highest number per capita of NGOs. There's something like 4,000 NGOs in Kosovo. My favorite story includes one that involves a charity dealing with traumatized animals, and I was reading, sort of helping a donor organization to sort of make sense of some sort of funding proposals that they received. And in 2001 they got one where, or maybe it was 2000, they got one where this particular charity applied for counseling programs for traumatized animals that had suffered mentally from the NATO air bombing campaign. So, if you have such a well-developed civil society that we can take care of traumatized animals, then I think maybe it's been a step too far. And then obviously reconciliation. South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for all the misgivings that people might have about it, I think has been quite an important element in the overall process of implementing conflict settlement. Now, once we come to the period of operation, I think really what is going on then is that sort of the political institutions that have been created in the agreement really begin to take hold of society, and you begin sort of to operate within these institutions. So there is power sharing, there is co-optation of leaders from local authorities into national governments and so on and so forth. A good example for that is Papua New Guinea and Bougainville, that, as I said, agreement achieved 1998, 1999, has been implemented since then, and relatively stable relationship now between the central government in PNG and the autonomous government in Bougainville. What also happens sometimes during the operation stage is that you have a renegotiation of the agreement or a reform of agreed institutions, which occurs in response normally to changing conditions or in response to the fact that parties wake up to a situation where they find that actually they didn't quite see it that way, or they didn't quite understand what they were signing up to. So Northern Ireland has been going through several such processes, beginning with the Mitchell Review early on in the implementation stage. And now we are seeing yet another major push by the two governments in London and Dublin, actually to move the parties in Northern Ireland forward to reach some sort of deal by which the devolved institutions finally can be restored to Belfast. And then finally, over time, what one hopes is a consolidation of democracy or some sort of normalization of relations between newly created states to emerge. And obviously, with all ups and downs, I think the Western Balkans, the former Yugoslavia, is not a bad example of how this process has developed over the past 10 years, even though I'm still a little bit wary of the situation in Serbia and sort of where Serbia might find itself at the end of the year. Now, historically speaking, what does normally work? So I've talked a lot about sort of process of conflict settlement and management. Now, obviously, there are very particular things that people do because they assume that this will resolve the conflicts that they have. Now, what normally does not work is genocide, obviously, not only because it's morally just not something that one can endorse, but also because usually the size of the task and the intervention that does at some point occur simply prevent the genocidaires from succeeding. The Holocaust didn't work, the Armenian genocide didn't work, Tibet didn't work, Burundi, Rwanda didn't work, Kurds in Iraq didn't work. There's simply no empirical evidence that would suggest that genocide, leaving aside the moral misgivings that one obviously has, is in any way a credible solution. The same thing goes for forced population transfers, expulsion, or what you might want to call ethnic cleansing. There were two big waves in the 20th, or three big waves in the 20th century after the First World War, involving in particular Greeks and Turks. After the Second World War, involving mostly Germans, but also there was ethnic cleansing of Hungarians from Czechoslovakia. There were various population exchanges, in inverted commas, on the fringes of the Soviet Union in the West, so between Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and so on and so forth. And then the third wave obviously was in the 1990s in Yugoslavia, Croat Serbs, Bosnians in the wars between 92 and 95, and then Kosovo Albanians 98, 99. In contrast, and I should just add that here's a little caveat, in contrast to these earlier experiences, now it is international community policy to reverse ethnic cleansing. So people actually are made to return to the areas from which they were cleansed. There are lots of things that one might say about this. I'm not always sure that this is necessarily the best possible solution. Forced assimilation also didn't work. Examples there: coercive domination. Look at the Middle East, South Africa, Kosovo. It's not something that really can work in the longer term. Things that do work for some time, but in the end always fail as well, is co-opted rule. The classical imperial example of divide et impera. All the empires have practiced that throughout history. And you also have sort of this kind of limited self-rule that the Ottoman millet system provided, the Austro-Hungarian compromise, the so-called dual monarchy, the South African homelands, and if you wanted to, you could even add here the republics of the former Soviet Union, which allowed some sort of ethnically defined self-rule. Four things normally do work, or often do work. Minority rights regimes. Sort of broadly speaking, non-discrimination, cultural rights, self-government rights, representation rights. And you find that in most multi-ethnic democracies, they have various provisions, constitutional or secondary legislation, that actually goes to that effect. Power sharing, two principal models, consociational and integrative power sharing. It does work in some places. It works less well in other places. Sort of the more dubious cases are in italics here. Northern Ireland. The interesting thing is that the political process is a complete failure, but the peace process has worked in Northern Ireland. So since basically the reinstatement of the second IRA ceasefire in 1996, you really have had a significant decline of violence. The institutions, as I said earlier, are still a mess. On the other hand, South Tyrol, Belgium, Switzerland all show that these consociational structures can work, albeit with the caveat that these are relatively rich, relatively small, relatively not so violent places. Integrative power sharing, again, number of European examples here where you have electoral mechanisms, for example, that encourage minority participation in political process, including government. Territorial solutions, autonomy, works reasonably well all over the world. Ethnofederalism, Spain, Belgium, Canada are examples here. There's also some sort of a federal arrangement in Nigeria, for example, in the new constitution for the Democratic Republic of Congo. And arguably even Ethiopia has an ethno-federal regime, even though it is doubtful the extent to which the actual institutions have been implemented over the past decade and a half now. And sometimes one has to agree or accept that even secession or dissolution of empires or partition of countries does work. I mean, Soviet Union worked relatively peacefully, the disintegration there. The opposite was Yugoslavia. Did not work particularly well, but we might now be heading towards some sort of stability. Czechoslovakia, not really a problem, partly also because the people didn't really want it. If you had done a referendum in Czechoslovakia in 1992, I doubt that you would have had a majority for separation between Slovakia and the Czech Republic. Ethiopia, Eritrea, the actual partition worked well, but then in the aftermath the countries have gone to war think 2 or 3 occasions, or at least been at the brink of war over demarcation of border. East Timor I have changed this morning to italicized because that doesn't seem to be going too well at the moment either. And then various bi- and multilateral regimes, either sort of bilateral minority treaties that, for example, Hungary and its neighbors have agreed. And then we have things like the Council of Europe Framework Convention for National Minority Rights, or the Charter for Regional and Minority Languages that provide sort of on a regional basis enforceable mechanisms of minority protection. Obviously, there are all these best laid plans that people have to resolve conflict, but they don't always work. There are 2 sets of difficulties here. Structural difficulties. To begin with, you have more than 2 conflict parties, or these conflict parties are internally divided. So it's not just a 2-party bargaining model as I explained earlier or illustrated earlier, but there's lots more things to consider, lots more interests to take into account. Or you have the problem that parties in themselves are split and fragmented. Northern Ireland, good example here. Sometimes you just can't get over the persistent and deep divisions. Sri Lanka. There were several occasions when the conflict looked very close to resolution, but then again it broke down because there was just not enough trust. High numbers of former combatants that need to be somehow integrated, somehow paid off in terms of sort of becoming civilians again. Sudan, a good example here. Where natural resources are at stake, where you don't have proper wealth sharing agreements, things might again turn nasty very quickly if certain parties feel that they have been shortchanged. Democratic Republic of Congo, civil war since 1998, mostly driven by what is sort of fashionably called blood diamonds. Secessionist claims in Kosovo, well, I mean, that's all there is to say. You can't really offer anything to the Kosovo Albanians that is less than independence, and at the same time it's very difficult for Serbs to accept that some part of the country that they consider historically and culturally hugely significant suddenly goes away and becomes independent. It obviously doesn't help if the state and the government have completely collapsed. Somalia, a classic example here, and if the economy remains weak, best laid institutional arrangements may simply not have the basis on which they can stand. But then there's also the problem of individual choices that people make. So we can't always just put it down on sort of structural factors that are beyond our control. So sometimes you just have enough spoilers around that rather see the conflict going than ended. Kashmir, a good example. Hostile transnational networks, mostly organized crime networks, Democratic Republic of Congo, and the way in which diamonds are exported to world markets. Hostile neighbors, I mentioned the example of Georgia and Russia earlier on. Sometimes it's also that the international community just doesn't get its act together, or when it gets it together, doesn't get it together properly. Now, the intervention in Somalia, not necessarily one of the better hours of humanitarian intervention. If you have weak or indecisive leaders that are unable or unwilling to commit their communities credibly to peace, it won't work. I put down the example of the Middle East here, but to some extent I think Northern Ireland would also be a good example. And then permanent lack of trust. I mean, if Ian Paisley just doesn't trust Republicans, then there isn't really much that you can do other than wait for him to depart the political scene. This is sort of the last slide leading us to next week's lecture. I think in particular the difficulties that I mentioned in the end show that there is a certain need for, I call it international intervention. One might be less adventurous and say, well, there is a need for international engagement in these situations. And there's basically sort of 7 different reasons for this, to which I will come back next week. I think the international community has a key role to play, really to promote inclusive settlements. Get as many parties on board as possible and prevent just the emergence of another front in the conflict. So if 3 parties can settle and they exclude 4 parties, then it's very likely that the next conflict will not be between 7 parties, but between 3 parties on the one hand and 4 parties on the other hand. Security guarantees, very, very important. After long civil wars, it's difficult for people to give up their guns. And they very often are only willing to do so if there are credible security guarantees. So think of Bosnia and the more than 100,000 troops that were there in the beginning, and now I think it's about 6,000 or 7,000. Help establish a working government and proper political institutions that can actually run a country that may have had nothing but civil war for several decades past. Rebuild the economy, facilitate transitional justice, think of criminal court in The Hague, for example, I think very important institution. Enable a timely renegotiation of agreements if necessary. So Northern Ireland, for example, the fact that George Mitchell came back in 2000 or 2001 to sort of sit the parties together again was very important in primarily enabling the disarmament and decommissioning process on the Republican side. And then obviously, because you have such a proliferation of international actors, governmental and non-governmental, it's very important also that there be coordination. So make sure that everybody marches into the same direction rather than sort of facilitate half a peace process there and quarter negotiation there and a little bit of proximity talks in another place. It's really important to sort of have a concerted, well-coordinated, almost singular effort. And this is another element that most studies of international intervention always bring out again, that there is lack of donor coordination. So I leave it at that, and I'll say more about sort of the particulars of international intervention next week, but I'd be more than happy to respond to any questions that you have.
Dr. Wolf was asked the following 4 questions. Question 1. Does ethnic cleansing make conflict resolution simpler or more difficult?
Now the question about ethnic cleansing is very difficult because empirically speaking there is evidence that yes, ethnic cleansing can create greater stability simply by creating more homogeneous units. So having said that, I think there are several problems. Both, there's a normative dimension, obviously. You can't just sort of say, yeah, let's just drive these people out and then we'll have peace. But there's also the issue here that obviously, even if you can create this kind of stability by unmixing ethnic communities, there are winners and losers, and the losers will always be resentful. So if you look at the Greek-Turkish experience, or the German-Polish, or the German-Czech experience, yes. But let's leave the Greek-Turkish experience aside because that's even more messy. But let's look at the German experience post-World War II. Yes, there hasn't been war between Poland and Germany or between Poland and the Czech Republic. But the first question one needs to ask, I think, is, was that because the Germans were driven out or because there was a Cold War stalemate? Second of all, relations as they have developed after the Cold War have significantly been influenced by those or their children and grandchildren who were actually driven out of these areas after 1945. And a lot of the bad blood that has been created between Germany and in particular the Czech Republic goes directly down to having these resentful, ethnically cleansed people living in one part of Germany or another. Now conversely, one could argue that it's not always so easy to say, well, if ethnic cleansing creates all these future liabilities, then we just have to undo it and we just have to send people back. Because that's not so easy either. Very often people don't want to go back. Talking to refugees, Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, or you mentioned the example of Kosovo Serbs, they have no intention of going back. So an international community policy that actually is geared towards undoing ethnic cleansing is not particularly useful. Rather, I think what should happen is, first of all, give people a choice, but also make it a meaningful choice in terms of giving them an opportunity to integrate where they have come to. And I think that is one of the key lessons that can be learned from the German experience in particular. Namely, you need to give people a future perspective once they have been ethnically cleansed. So the fact that all the ex-police were integrated quite well economically and politically in Germany has contributed to the fact that there were no calls for let's reconquer the Eastern Territories in 1990, and the calls that there were one or two, but they were totally not credible or had no backing whatsoever. And by the same token, if you look at the Middle East, one of the key problems is that the Palestinian refugees have lived in these terrible refugee camps for decades now. There has been no effort really made to give them a perspective in these camps, sort of to make a real life of their own. So obviously they want to go back to sort of some idealized nostalgic memory that they have from the pre-1948 state. And that obviously also then is a factor where you would say, yeah, ethnic cleansing doesn't work because it creates these future liabilities. But the future liabilities are all the greater if you do not something about once ethnic cleansing has happened and provide useful alternative.
Question 2. What do we mean by a civil society in a global context? Do we mean sincerely that we want to work with and put money into any civil society when not all of them are the humane, liberalist, platonic types that Western societies like to promote?
I completely agree with the doubts that I think you implicitly voiced here about this whole concept of civil society. I mean, it's on the one hand sort of the extent to which our Western conceptions of civil society being one of the foundations of democracy actually helps. But very often what we also find is that you look at these conflicts in civil society, if you just look at the numbers, looks great. But really what happens is that you have sort of 2, 3 or 4 parallel civil societies where each ethnic community sort of has its own civil society, which does all the things that you expect a civil society to do. But cumulatively, having these separate civil societies only reinforces the cleavages that already exist in society. Now, I'm not suggesting we should do without civil society, but I think one needs to be more careful, as you said, and as I failed to do in this talk, in terms of defining really what kind of civil society is it that we want. How do we envisage it structured? What aims and goals do we want these organizations to pursue? And do we just fund something because it's called civil society and because we can tick boxes and mention all the right buzzwords that we want to hear? Or is there something else to be said about primarily focusing, and I think that is the important part, really on building political institutions indigenously that then can foster the emergence of a civil society. I mean, it's sometimes a chicken and egg question in a conflict situation. Do you need civil society first to create the proper institutions, or do you create the institutions first that then can provide the framework in which civil society can emerge, and the kind of civil society that would actually support the institutions?
Question 3. With regards to Iraq, what do you think are the prospects for the various approaches?
The Iraqi constitution is actually not so bad. I mean, the problem is that it hasn't been fully implemented, and there's no government there at the moment that really would embody the constitution not only in letter but also in spirit. What I would have argued for would have been at least an interim period where you have mandatory power sharing between the communities. I mean, if you look back at the South African experience, sort of between 1990 and 1996, or at least from the 1994 elections to the 1996 constitutional referendum, you did have a period there where all the main parties were part of the government, 94-96, but also part of the Constitutional Commission, that made sure that once you had this transition to a more majoritarian type of democracy, actually everybody was somehow catered for in terms of basic guarantees. Now, the Iraqi constitution in this respect isn't actually so bad because it provides various assurances for the Kurds and for the Sunnis and for the Shias, and sort of makes sure that everybody has access to whatever wealth they have in their areas, and there are basic guarantees for human rights and so on and so forth. So I think in the end, this constitution can work. What needs to happen before it can work is, in my view, much greater engagement across the divide at the moment, especially sort of the Sunni-Shia divide. And that will mean at some point that what I would call the nationalist part of the insurgency is a proper engagement. There's a proper negotiation process, bargaining process with those guys. Because in contrast to the late al-Zarqawi, they are not, excuse my language, nutcases that are just after some global jihadist idea. But these are actually people that you can buy off, so to speak. So you can make concessions to them. You can bring them into a political process where some of them have quite legitimate concerns that I think is not difficult to understand or even to share. They are not particularly happy with sort of a potentially Shia Islamic Republic of Iraq, with the northern parts where the Kurds live either independent or quasi-independent. So crystal ball gazing would be, yes, the constitution as it exists at the moment for Iraq will work, but it will require more formal power-sharing institutions, in particular bringing in Sunni components into that deal.
Question 4. It seems that the vagaries of Iraq's constitution means that it doesn't deal in a hard and fast way with the sharing of oil wealth amongst the various groups. Doesn't this lead to a pessimistic outlook for bringing the groups together?
There's two things. The first, I think, is that the constitution as it exists, in my view, provides a framework within which you can address these different issues. But in order to address them in a way that all the parties will be satisfied, I think you need this more inclusive deal to be brokered over the next probably year or 2 years. So yes, the constitution is vague in parts, constructively ambiguous. I mean, the question is how constructive is it, of course. But I still think that there is nothing wrong with the constitution as such. I mean, it's the question of the institutions actually being set up properly and being made working properly that is the problem. And there's a famous saying by a former judge at the US Supreme Court: the Constitution is what judges say it is. So there's always interpretation there. The question is, to what extent can you minimize the dangers of these interpretations? And I think that will be something which you can only come together in some sort of national consensus that involves secular and religious groups, that involves the various ethnic groups in Iraq, that involves nationalists, non-nationalists, and so on and so forth. So I think that is still an evolving process. Now, the other thing in terms of the voting participation of Sunnis, yes, they didn't bother voting in the constitution because that was in a way more or less pointless, because the way in which the voting procedure for the constitution was changed at the last minute, it was extremely unlikely that Sunnis would get a blocking vote on the constitution. However, what is interesting is that actually in the elections in January, there was much greater Sunni participation, and there was even a ceasefire that the nationalist part of the insurgency, so basically the Ba'athist Sunnis, had implemented, in which there were first signs of a possible fallout between those guys in the insurgency and the Al-Qaeda type insurgency, because the Sunnis were very keen actually to participate in the elections in order to get their people elected into parliament, and to make sure that the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iran did actually not get the absolute majority that they would have wanted to get. And this worked relatively well. So, I mean, the main Shia bloc does need to establish a coalition, and I mean, the fact that it's taken 5 months to actually get that process going shows that the Sunnis were A, successful, but B, also quite serious about their own involvement in the political process. Which again brings me back to the point that I made about the Constitution. The Constitution does allow for a consensus-led bargaining process. But then we come back to the question of structural difficulties and difficulties related to individual choices. Obviously that it took the Shia ages to come up with a compromise candidate for Prime Minister does not bode too well for the degree to which major political factions within the Shia community are actually willing to engage in a constructive bargaining process. So one of the dangers that unfortunately is also possible under the constitution is that there's a deal between Kurds and Shias. They all hold on to their wealth. They basically get quasi-federal state. Yeah. And the Sunnis around Baghdad end up in a desert-like situation with, Baghdad minus the green zone and some desert lands around with no resources, with no agriculture, no nothing. So and that, I think, is where you're absolutely right. This is a danger that is there in the Constitution.
Dr. Wolf can be contacted by email at Stefan, spelt Stefan, at stefanwolf, spelt StefanWolff.com.